Welcome back for more from our workshop in the 2021 NICE project. But before we move on to our selective passage, I wanted to just talk a little bit more about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the racist, because we can't, how do I want to say this? We can't avoid some of the difficult things that sometimes we run across when we pick books, works that are from a different time period. And especially we can't avoid things that might be rather unpleasant. So Gilman herself was the great niece of abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, but she was a racist. And here I've created this image. I wanted to give this quote to you. This is something that she wrote about Black Americans in 1909, and this was published in the American Journal of Sociology. We have to consider the unavoidable presence of a large body of aliens of a race widely dissimilar and in many respects inferior, whose present status is to us a social injury. I mean, this is pretty horrible, you know. And we always have to say at the outset that we try to confront, whether it's in the text of a book we're looking at or in the life of the author of the books that we're looking at, we always try to confront these issues and deal with them and be honest about them. And so as much as I love the Yellow Wallpaper, some of this is very hard and very distressing. She also said in the same article, the problem is this. Given in the same country, race A progressed in social evolution, say, to status 10, and race B progressed in social evolution, say, to status 4. Given that race B in its present condition does not develop fast enough to suit race A. Question: how can race A best and most quickly promote the development of race B? Now, I have to say, the given, those are so obnoxious and horrific. The question, how can one race best and most quickly promote the development of race B, might be, you might think, well, at least she's trying to help people. Well, this was her solution. Her solution was that all Blacks beneath a certain grade of citizenship, those who were not decent, self-supporting, and progressive, should be taken hold of by the state. Gilman called this enlistment, not enslavement. Her system required the enforced labor of Black Americans, men, women, and children. The enlisted would receive a wage only after the cost of the labor program was covered. And I have to say that everything on my slide here that is boldface and italics is quotes directly from the article. So that is rather unpleasant to think about too. My final thought on Gilman, the racist, is that she did believe old stock Americans of British colonial descent were giving up their country to immigrants. She said immigrants were diluting the nation's reproductive purity. During a trip to London, when asked about her stance on immigration, Gilman famously quipped, "I am Anglo-Saxon before everything." So, there you have some rather unpleasant things to think about. I'm sorry. In terms of, we always try to talk a little bit about the author. So, you know, when we're talking about the book and thinking about these images on racism, I have to ask, you know, I have to ask you guys, do you feel that Gilman's racist notions affect your reading of the Yellow Wallpaper? But, you know, it's the same old question we always ask. Does the author's life add or detract from the story? And if so, how? So I've talked enough for a while. I want to open up the floor to some other thoughts and voices. Sarah E., I know you had some thoughts on this. You want to start us off?
Sure, I will absolutely start us off. Yeah, when I first read Yellow Wallpaper, I had no idea of the racist thoughts that the author had. And I say that's such a shame because I feel that that limits which oppressed groups can relate to the story freely.
Yeah.
You know, if Gilman weren't such a racist, I think that anyone struggling to free themselves from some type of system of oppression, including Black people, would see themselves, you know, as being, they could relate to that woman who was caught in that wallpaper.
Yeah.
And the idea that she's being choked, she sees these bulbous heads that are being strangled. That reminds me so much of the quote that became so associated with the Black Lives Matter movement related to George Floyd, the I Can't Breathe.
Oh, yeah. Great point. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I am not a Black person. I am a white chick. And so doubtless there is a Black reader listening who can absolutely still relate to the story. They subscribe to Death of the Author. It does not matter her background, and they can still relate. But doubtless that there is another unique Black reader who this is a barrier. And it occurs to me, probably 3-4 years ago now, we brought in a guest speaker, a professor who talked about the modern definition of feminism. And as she described it, is the sound coming across your camera?
Yeah.
Okay, good. She brought up the idea that feminism in a modern sense is really standing up for any marginalized group. And I love that thought in theory. It definitely doesn't work for Gilman, but she's not modern.
Yeah.
But I would say that it doesn't work for every feminist today. Like, a Karen might claim to be a feminist and, call the cops on somebody for being Black and barbecuing at the same time. A TERF, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, they exclude. So what I really think, though, my point is here is that I think it's a shame that there is this background, because I feel like that can hold back how relevant the story might be to a wide group of people.
Yes, I agree with you. And I want to hear from everybody else, but I do want to say it is so odd for Sarah E. and myself to have chosen a book that is kind of iconic as a piece of feminist literature, and then, to have to present it as being by an author who was a racist. It's just, the feminist racist is not one of our normal, that's not an author we usually have to talk about. So we had to bring it up. So Deborah, Chris, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share before we move on to the selected passage?
Well, the whole thing about the racist stuff is just, it's a whole other layer on the onion that I wasn't planning on entering into. My own history with the book is, I had first read Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the 70s. I was one of those brawless feminists, and every one of us had that book on our bookshelves, and we spoke in yellow wallpaper analogies. We use the yellow wallpaper as an analogy for different kinds of oppression. So that she gave us a language, and she gave us a shared story in our fist clenching and placard carrying days, and I left it at that. But my own history with it is, as I grew and tried to become wiser and learn other things, I have read the book 3 other times since that era. Since
the
that
70s?
It was the icon. Every feminist had to have read it in order. It was kind of like a rite of passage to know Charlotte Perkins Gilman's work, and hate men and what they did to them and how they were oppressive. And this is just another example of, and she can break free, and you don't blame her insanity, because it was her freedom, and I mean all of that went with it. But I found that over the decades, as I would revisit this book, I really tried to read it differently by the eyes of the person I was at that time. And when I was in the beginning of raising children, and read it one night with a glass of wine and reading it and trying to understand the way of the world and trying to figure out how I wanted to raise my children, and the whole thing about equality, and you can be who you want to be and believe in what you want to believe. It was interesting that in that revisiting it, I found myself to become purposefully intentional on taking her husband's point of view. At that time, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, he and Dr. Mitchell were doing the best that they thought that they could do at that time. When you think about today, people go to spas to rest. And so, so they had this opportunity to stay at a friend's home in the woods and away from society and away from the hustle and bustle and responsibilities and everything. And during that particular revisiting with the book, I didn't hold him to be such a monster, either him or Dr. Mitchell, to be such a monster, because they felt that they were doing what best they could for this person.
And that is why
so
it's
I
important to
kind of-
remember when it's written, 1892 when it was
definitely, because
published.
that's
That's
what they had. It'd be a
Sure,
historical account.
But what you're
And so
saying is,
I had to calm my jets a little bit, and and not be so feminist and fist shaking and the whole bit about it, and say, no, wait a minute. There's another side to this story. And then the third reading that when I came across this is the point that you had made, and this is maybe where your whole thing about racism all comes into play. She wasn't purposefully, fisting up saying, I'm a racist. I don't know, did they even have the term back then? I mean, they had what they had, but they had what they had at that time.
I think by 1892, and when she was writing for the American Sociology
there was
Journal,
still a difference because cultures didn't understand cultures, and I know that her system of belief, was of that time. So, in my third reading of this book, I was seeing it as a voice comparable to the brawless feminists of the 70s. I was seeing it as a voice of the oppressed, no matter if it's sex, skin color, whatever, that there is this story of oppression, and there were these people that played a part in keeping this person oppressed, how this person faced this oppression, and how this person resolved the oppression, whether it's like I said, skin, label, sex, religious belief, no matter what it is. So I saw it more as a formula. And then this last reading, since when you chose it as a piece for NICE, when I was reading it, since I had grown through the rereadings in my relationship with this book in these three different ways of taking it in, this fourth time as a part of this project, I was looking at it more as a piece of literature. I was looking at it more as a piece of language, and how she relied on the language, and how she drew me in as a reader, and how I was taken into the story, the story come what may. But I looked at it more as, maybe it was the English teacher in me.
You looked more at structure.
That took it on in this way. So I have read this same book, and it's been 4 different books all at once.
Yeah.
And as far as an art piece, I'm gonna have to flip a coin. Which eyes do I want to?
Sure.
Take? So
well, and that's one of the reasons.
That is my relationship with this book, and I'm not gonna, that's where it is. And I'm sure that if there's a 5th reading of it on down the line, when I get a little bit wiser and have more experiences under my belt, I will probably read it even differently. Yes. At that time.
Well, and I think that's what one of the goals of our project is. First of all, everybody who participates in any way, even if we never see them, even if they're not in workshops, we never hear from them, but they are reading the books at home and revisiting them. They have their own journeys, just like you have told us. And I have my own journey. Sarah E has her own journey. I think the difference between when this came out in 1892 to what you experienced in the 70s, which was, you know, the first wave of, or the second wave really of feminism in America, you know, that's a huge difference in the audience that was reading this book from the time it was published to the time in the 70s and even further into today. I will have to say one thing about you know, bringing up Charlotte Perkins Gilman as being racist. She was racist. She was a self-acknowledged racist. The title of her article in the American Journal of Sociology in 1909, I mean, we're not talking about before the Civil War. I mean, this is 1909, the title was A Suggestion on the Negro Problem. Now, you know, that title alone is self-admitting that she sees a Negro problem. So she was not in with the abolitionists of her great aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She didn't believe in the equality of Black Americans to white Americans. And that, you know, I presented snippets of what is known about her as a racist. So I encourage anybody who wants to delve more into her personal life, whether it's her feminist theories and her work with feminist organizations, or further into reading more about what she had to say about race and different things like that, to go ahead. I just wanted to present a little bit because I felt obligated. We're going to be talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs and Tarzan of the Apes, and Edgar Rice Burroughs is our counterpoint to Charlotte Perkins Gilman. He's the male that he's very prejudiced and racist, and we're going to have to deal with that. Join us next time as we continue with our workshop discussion for the 2021 NICE project.